I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Gary Nolan, professor in the Department of Pathology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. His research is in microbiology, immunology, biocomputation, analysis of UFO materials, and the investigation of reported UFO encounters. Dr. Nolan has a BS in genetics from Cornell, a PhD in genetics from Stanford, and a postdoc fellowship at MIT. His work includes research into the pathological disturbances in the immune system and cancer research using advanced mathematical and computational approaches to help understand biological and clinical outcomes. He's the founder of several companies such as Apprise Biotech, Nodality, Bina, and Rigel. And he is, of course, well known for his work into the UAP phenomena and UFOs. So, Gary, welcome, sir. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it is truly an honor to have you with me. So today we're talking primarily about UAP. So I wanted to start with current events. It's been kind of a crazy week, but Congress this year has decided to start studying historical UAP phenomena back to 1945. And the Air Force, as we all know, spent last weekend shooting down unknown objects across the country. So I was hoping to start out with your thoughts on where things currently stand.
Well, I mean, just even 2 weeks ago, who could have even predicted where it is today? I mean, just go back a year, and we all thought that the whole thing had slowed down to a standstill. So I think the actions in the last week made at the federal level are extraordinary. I mean, creating an interagency task force, which basically extends the reach of inquiries into various departments is it's just phenomenal. I mean, Arrow already in and of itself was a fantastic opportunity to start to get to the bottom of some of these things. But as I know from discussions with other people, Arrow had limitations in its breadth and reach, and now establishing this larger program is going to really enable basically a reach into many other things. The open question, of course, is right, where does the data go? Will people use the Arrow versus interagency task force as a way to hold up information because we don't know who we're supposed to give this to, et cetera? So, net, I think it's a super positive, but there's going to be a little bit of confusion, obviously, in the interim.
Yeah. Well, and again, just in the last week, I think that's added a lot to the confusion because now we're mixing in balloons. So we had at least one, what's called a Chinese spy balloon, and now we have three relatively unknown objects, which may or may not be balloons. And then that's in some ways that dovetails into this existing, as you mentioned, the Arrow program and this inquiry that goes back in time. So it seems like there's definitely a lot, and there's some overlap, but it's not like a one-for-one overlap, right? So there's going to be more confusion there.
There's hardly a person in the country who's even paying attention to the news at any level who doesn't know that this is now going on. My husband, for instance, has fielded a number of phone calls from friends of ours who knew of my interest in this area and were, always positively inclined in conversation. But now they're calling me saying, "What's going on? What's going on?" So I think it's, I think now it's up to the community who's interested in this not to overread into what's happening, not to get too excited, and not to be disappointed just because tomorrow's episode doesn't give them the finale that they're waiting for. And so let's just keep moving on slowly, realize that there's going to be a lot of people who need to digest what's going on here, but the aperture is opened. And that's a fantastic thing.
That I think actually what you touched on, that is such an important point. There's intellectual acceptance and then there's emotional acceptance. And people actually yell at me for saying this, but intellectually, I think that we all know something is going on. I think that many of us believe, I do, that there is something here that's extraterrestrial in nature, but emotionally, that is so difficult to accept, So.
Well, I think if I mean, for those who are knowledgeable of the things that are going on, et cetera, I mean, we're I think well past the point of denial. But for those who are looking to the government for acknowledgement, you only have to listen to the multiple senators now and the multiple congressmen and congresswomen who've come out and said, there's something worth following up on here. None of them have said, oh, it's aliens, but they've all said, this is way deeper than anybody expected. And I mean, I forget the name of the senator who just said it today. I said, the public has a right to know.
Yeah, yeah, they do, and I think it'll be a process over time, right?
Mhm.
Whether or not we want that, I think it'll be a process
Yeah.
of acceptance, So, um, in your own history, let me get into the Atacama skeleton. That is kind of what you got. That's kind of what got you into the public spotlight, and it looked like a baby alien. And you did research on this and determined that it wasn't extraterrestrial. You later studied suspected UAP exposure in DoD patients. That ended up being really the first cases of Havana syndrome, but again, not UAP related. So one of the things I wondered was, I mean, given these two, I guess, early investigations that turned out not to be related to this, what kept you pushing forward in UFOs?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I did the Atacama in the first place was because I knew I could. I saw that it was an extraordinary specimen, no doubt about it. And I thought, well, I can do something with this. Let's try it. I did it. We published a peer-reviewed paper. Some people didn't like it, who wanted to be something else and were convinced I was bought off. Well, that's fine. They can go get the sample and prove me wrong and get me kicked out of Stanford if they want, if they can prove me wrong. I dare them. And so, but really what I was doing was I was thinking about this, was I was kind of sending up a flag to the scientific community. First of all, to say, it's okay to look at this. And second, anybody else out there? And, and then what happened was serious, incredible scientists came forward to me. And eventually it's how I met people like Jacques Vallée, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, Kit Green, et cetera. So that was kind of like my first meeting of the so-called invisible college of individuals who very rapidly took me from 0 to 100 in terms of my knowledge base. So that, I mean, probably I would have wandered in the wilderness for another decade, not really knowing how to direct my energies. So I think that was a tremendous opportunity. And working with Kit Green on the DoD patients, I mean, let me correct slightly one of the things that you said there. Yes, the majority of the patients ended up being what we think is Havana syndrome. There were, though, just like UAP cases, there were a few that were unexplained and where they did have
Okay.
interactions with some sort of anomalous interaction. And in fact, one of them was in where was it? It was in the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon.
Oh,
If you
okay.
read, I think it's like in the page 30, the guy who saw something in his backyard, a triangle thing that shot a beam of light. I mean, I knew about that as far back as 2014, 2015. Um, so anyway, I think that's, quite interesting.
Yeah, well, so one of the things, and I want to tread lightly into this area, but um, this idea, I guess, of I think we're starting to feel like ET or UAP have been here for a very long time, right?
Hmm.
No one's sure how long, but this didn't start in 1945. I think it looks like it started potentially millennia ago. And that then leads into this question of, how are they interacting with us? And as a geneticist, as someone with a knowledge and focus and expertise in biology, one of the things I'd wondered was, have you explored this idea of have they changed us or are they in the process of changing us in any way? That's something that's out there. It's been
Right.
circulating online. So I wanted to touch on that.
I see that all the time, and I don't want to be the party pooper on this. There's it's not that there's no evidence. There's no way to determine if the evidence would be real or not. I mean, against what are you comparing this? You have the genome of probably several million people already. You've got graduate students and postdocs and companies poring over the data, looking for minuscule cues of diagnostic predictions for cancers, et cetera, or various diseases. You'd think somebody would have noticed something by now that was out of place. So the short answer is, I don't have to go looking for it. The world at large has been looking at genomes, and nobody has found it. I mean, look, we've been able to see evidence of interbreeding with Denisovans and Neanderthals from several tens of thousands of years ago. That's how sensitive these techniques are. There's going to be no mashup that you're going to find where some alien is going to come in and drop a sequence or another chromosome in, and that's not going to show up somehow. So I think I'm not disparaging it. I'm just saying that there's way more subtle ways to interact with a species evolution than directly engineering their DNA. I mean, the mutations will show up anyway, just as a matter of course. And if it really is all about making sure that that individual lives and spreads their genes, right? I mean, we do this with dogs all the time, right? We breed dogs without doing any genetic engineering, and look at what we've done in just a few thousand years.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And so you're talking about, if I remember right, like hybridization and things like that. Yeah, with dogs, we're not actually editing their genes. We're just selecting traits that we
We're
want, right?
selecting traits. So I mean, I've never seen any evidence of this, and it's and again, it's not just me. It's thousands of scientists who look at these genomes every day, run complicated computer programs on them to sift them for signatures of disease. All you have to do is change the word disease into alien, and and there's still no correlation.
Yeah. Well, and I guess this is also connected. And again, it makes me uncomfortable to ask, but in terms of reported abductions, I guess,
Mhm.
and this really started to come to the highlight, I guess, in the late 1970s. I think Travis Walton was really the first one that truly made headlines here.
Mhm.
Now, these are generally explained, right, through things like sleep paralysis and bad dreams and psychologically related things.
Mhm.
And in terms of a subjective experience, I mean, that it absolutely doesn't devalue them, but that also doesn't mean that if someone thinks that they saw an alien, that they necessarily did. Do you think that that's a real phenomena? And if ET is interacting with us, which it sounds like they
Mhm.
probably aren't, but if they are interacting with us in some way, do you think that that might be related?
I mean, sure. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't disparage any data, right? And certainly, I don't disparage anybody's experiences. It's the repeatability, the repeated nature of it from multiple parallel sources that makes it, to me, something worth paying attention to. I mean, I've been sort of beating this particular drum for a while now, is that for the lay public, an anecdote, which is a one-time story of something or an event, is actually a disparagement. You say, oh, it's an anecdote. In clinical terms, actually, an anecdote is considered real, right? There's an anecdote, you have an anecdotal clinical case, and this is what happened, and you write up a case report of it, and you put it in, and now it's part of the data set. So we need to translate that concept of anecdotes over to the clinical realm, and to basically make it so that people feel that the things that they're saying, it's at the very least a psychological truth.
Yeah,
And so and John Mack, of course, has explored this in extraordinary depth. That it's either mass hypnosis, real, or mass delusion, or something else going on. So
well,
it's
and
real whether it's material or not, or whether it's something in the mind. Who can say?
as the UAP phenomena changes and becomes more accepted, right, it
Hmm.
seems like that raises this impetus to investigate abductions, at least in my mind. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's anything more than subjectivism, but there is this aspect to it of, okay, we used to dismiss these and say, well,
Hmm.
UFOs aren't real, aliens aren't real, so therefore
Hmm.
abductions can't be real. It was
Hmm.
a bad dream, it was sleep paralysis. Now we're saying, well, wait a minute, UFOs are real. Congress is investigating them, and they haven't outright said it yet. But I mean, reading between the lines, they're saying it can't be this, 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 or this. So it looks like it's extraterrestrial. In that case, it seems like we should definitely be paying a lot more attention to abduction reports in the future.
Yeah, I think the report should be paid attention to. I think I I look at it as, let's call it a research project. The whole thing is a research project. You start and you establish your credentials, the foundation. So let's get the foundation working, and then once you get people to 100% agree, okay, it's real. Then the slightly more extreme claims, alleged claims, can now rest on a foundation that's solid. I mean, that's how science works. Science works by establishing facts and then correlating one fact to another. If you have a fact sitting in space, uncorrelated to anything else, it could just as well float away, right? Because it's not correlated, it's not anchored to anything. So the anchor, at least to me, this is my linear way of thinking, is that we start with the foundation of where we are today, get that over, and then you can start to ask any of the more interesting questions, everything from the nature of consciousness, involvement in all of this, and people's perceived abductions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so that's all on the biological side, right? That's on the human
Mhm.
side of things. Now, you've also done work with materials. You had something that was called Brazil magnesium from the Utabuba event, and I believe there were strange isotope ratios at magnesium in one of the two samples that you were sent at that. So I thought that was really interesting. Also, I wanted to touch on that. If I understand correctly, this was something that you were given. You did some testing on it. In another show, you talked about actually doing identical testing in an identical chamber at the same time. And the isotope ratios in one sample were really normal for Earth-like magnesium. And in the other, they were highly skewed, I guess.
Hmm. Right, that's exactly right. And the instrument is called NanoSims. It's made by Kamika, and it's actually they're, I think, located in Wisconsin. And it's a it's an extraordinary sensitive instrument. And basically, you put your samples on a little disc, and so we placed one of the samples, next to the other, and then you move it into the instrument through various vacuum chambers, because this is all done in a deep vacuum. And then you shoot a beam of ions at it, and this is a secondary ion mass spec. So then you collect the ions that are sputtered off. You can think of it as you're basically power washing something, sandblasting it. And so the best experiments are done under very controlled circumstances, where it's not the difference between I ran it today and I'm running it next week, and so somebody twiddled a dial wrong. They were run right next to each other within minutes of each other.
Mm.
So I feel quite confident about the result. And so, I've said this before on other programs. It's, why would anybody go to the bother of altering the ratio of this material, and in the magnesium in this material? And I can't. There's no physics or chemistry reason to do it that anybody thinks of. Can anybody think of in our current understanding of how you use materials? So then you have to explore mentally. Okay, well, who or why would somebody do it? Because that is actually the more important question. Why would somebody do it? But then the most important conclusion that you reasonably can make from it is that somebody engineered it, or it is the process of it is the result of an industrial process. And so
Yeah.
that's important. That means it isn't just something that washed up on a beach, from some volcanic eruption. It's something that somebody either made and threw away, or and it's an important part of something, or it's the exhaust, for all I know.
And it seemed to me, when I looked at that, I said, this seems like really strong circumstantial evidence, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if and I think you'd mentioned there was a chain of custody and there's a well-documented report behind it.
Yeah.
And
This is
so,
all something I got from Jacques Vallée. I mean, almost all of the materials that I've studied came through Jacques Vallée.
yeah, Yeah. So it is interesting. Again, it goes back to this idea of, UAP being a much more real, I guess, that we've looked at in
Hmm.
the past. And we're just going
Hmm.
to have to, come to terms with that and accept that. Um, so one of the things that I wondered about when I was thinking about these Brazil samples was the language barriers between North and South America, right? And from there, it's easy to say, well, this is a phenomenon that affects everyone all over the world. It's reported worldwide. And I wanted to ask you about Project Titan, which is a new initiative by the government of San Marino to finally get UFOs attention at the United Nations.
Hmm.
And the more I think about that, the more excited I get because it seems like even though there is data that's shared across cultural and language boundaries,
Hmm.
it's really not well coordinated, right? And now that we have more transparency and openness here in the United States, do you think that that may help if the UN is able to get involved?
Well, I mean, I've known about the San Marino initiative for about a year and a half now. And I know something was supposed to happen last year, but it couldn't. So I think, first of all, the fact that it managed to be passed uh, I think it was passed, wasn't it? I can't remember. I'm blanking. Um, you know, before after Arrow, but before the interagency task force. Now, the fact that the interagency task force has been set up by Biden, that actually opens the door at the UN, I think, for San Marino to step in and says, look, the United States is doing this. Why should we be left behind to create an international effort, right? Because, yes, the US might have great resources, but, if I were UFOs, I wouldn't have spent all my time looking at the United States.
Yeah, well, and like France, I know has done wonderful work,
Well, they've
right?
done amazing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the most part, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of communication between the US and other, even NATO countries. I mean, I haven't seen a lot. I know there's been work that's been done in Canada. There's been tons of work done in France, and you don't
And
see,
Brazil.
yeah, the US government is doing analysis on this on their own, but it doesn't seem like they're doing a lot of this, um, international collaboration, I guess. So,
Well, I think I'd look at it a little bit differently. The US uh, has had, let's say, a materials collection program that basically goes around and takes or agrees to study materials from around the world, right? And then it's a black hole. The samples come in, no data comes out. And so, there's apparently agreement behind the scenes, and you could talk to Russ Colhert more deeply about this. There's agreements behind the scenes, so it's just not agreements in front of the screen.
oh, okay. I wasn't even aware of that. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Well, I mean, it's just this is hearsay. He said, et cetera. So it's not anything that is, but I mean, look at the I can't quite say the Varhina incident, right? That James Fox wrote about, and then the purported events that occurred that basically after the whatever they were captured, the U.S. shows up in helicopters and whisks the bodies away,
Yeah,
never to be seen of again.
yeah, yeah. Crash retrieval teams. I think
Yeah,
Sean Cahill had mentioned those as well.
right, right.
And again, to complicate things even further, I think crash retrieval is something that's part of traditional military duties, right? So if a jet fighter crashes, you have a crash retrieval team that's going to
Hmm.
go out there and collect sensitive stuff, right? That could be obviously
Right.
weapons, data, things along those lines. So they could use that same thing in other ways. And so just by having a crash retrieval team doesn't necessarily mean that, they're
Right.
doing it for UFOs.
Hmm.
So, well, I wanted to ask again, I'm coming back to this. We have 70 years of myth and legend involved with this. And it's gone into this cultural blender, right? I
Hmm.
mean, we've got UFO culture is mainstream in movies like Independence Day and Men in Black,
Hmm.
I mean, you can buy, toys at the toy store, with
Hmm.
UFOs all the time. So, how difficult do you think it will be to separate the science from this literal mountain of mythology that we've created?
Well, I mean, it's frankly, it's simple. It's just collect data, get it peer reviewed, and just start telling the truth of what the data means. I mean, humans are who we are today because of stories. So we just need to narrate the stories a little more accurately, and not speculate and add peccadillos for the sake of a giggle or two, or a dollar or two. And so, for me at least, I mean, that's what I did with the publication of the peer-reviewed paper on a UFO material that had dropped in Council Bluffs. It was just a straight up, here's the data. I mean, if it was dry as bone, it could suck the air out of a room, and that's the point. Is data should not be hyped. It shouldn't be, PR'd on Twitter. I mean, once you've published it, you can,
Yeah, then
strut around all you want. But I mean, that's the way to do it. And it's not because peer review makes it real. Peer review says that you've gone through an agreed upon process for validation that everything you did up to that point was right. And frankly, most of the time, if you actually read and the science, the language of science, when you read the papers, you can see all the caveats, the maybes, this might, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is just part of my general understanding when I talk to another scientist. But when I talk to a layperson, I say it might be something. The next thing, it's on Twitter, Gary Nolan said this.
yeah.
And so I think the audience, your audience, the lay people, need to become more familiar with the maybes of how science operates.
Yeah, definitely the maybes. And then, one of the things that I've seen coming from a business background is in business, we use a lot of softeners, right? And softeners are really giant, and
Mm-hmm.
and those are, I guess you could also call those maybes, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not a problem, it's a concern. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
concern, it's,
Yeah.
yeah. So things along those lines. And it just softens that impact a little bit. Um, so I wanted to ask, in terms of all of these stories, again, we could call it mythology, some of it may be real. Do you have any particular ones that you think are more likely to be real and others that you're less likely to believe in?
Um, I mean, the two or three that I come up with are not ones that I originated. But Hal Puthoff's and Eric's ultra-terrestrial idea that something's been here for a long time, and it's not that it's Earthborn, but it has been here for a long time, so it might as well be. And the thing I like to sort of get people to think about: if something's been here longer than we've been civilized or we were even sentient, is this really our planet? Do we own Earth?
Well, no, you know what, actually, I didn't write that in the questions, but I've been wondering that myself. If it has been here for that amount of time, isn't Earth just as much its home as ours?
Yes, exactly. And that's the point. So it's not like they're invading. I mean, we showed up after they've been around. So the ultra terrestrial idea is one. Sort of akin to that is the notion of consciousness, right? Because there's, as we know, there's all of this weirdness that seems to happen whenever UFOs show up. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? I mean, like on the Skinwalker Ranch, somebody sees an object or the so-called hitchhiker effect, and something follows them home. Well, what does that mean? How is that UFOs? Is it? I have to wonder. Okay, well, is the fact that the UFOs here has opened a portal that allows other stuff to come through? And I just don't know. I mean, I don't understand it. But again, it's phenomenon. It's repeatedly reported, and so to me, it's data. I can ignore it at my risk, I'd say. But I just find it fascinating. I mean, I think the problems that I've always been attracted to as a scientist are the things that are almost unsolvable, because
Yeah.
they're like the brain teaser that you just want to understand. So there's that one, and then there's Jacques' idea of the interdimensionals, right? Or the control theory aspect of reality. And so, those are the most likely. And so I think, when people say, oh, well, it can't be aliens because we don't have the ability to, they couldn't have the ability to cross between stars. Well, first of all, that's just foolish to even say that. I mean, we already understand that there's the potential for warp drive. But second, if they've always been here, then they didn't need to come here. So you can just dismiss those people.
Well,
Neil
it
deGrasse
is.
Tyson is always going on about stuff like that.
y- y-
Ridiculous.
Yeah, in some ways it seems like mainstream science tends to still intentionally obfuscate this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Well, it's the rhetoric of using one demonstrable impossibility, which frankly is not a demonstrable impossibility, the idea that they wouldn't be able to cross between the stars, and that is sufficient to shut down any further discussion. And that's just a form of rhetorical banditry, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and even without exceeding the speed of light, one of the things I looked at was, could these potentially be von Neumann probes, right? And
Right.
if that's the case, a self-replicating von Neumann probe, you could actually explore the galaxy at sublight in less than 50 replication events. So,
Well, I'm an advisor to a company that um, uh, Avi Loeb has started, the
yeah,
Copernicus Space Corporation, and we're planning to do exactly that. And we're already planning, probe designs for sending stuff to Mars. And what would it look like? What do we need to look for? And if we get there, how do we print more of ourselves? Or we send them out to the, what would we need in the asteroid belt to make more copies of ourselves? So, if it's going to be doable. And so, we will do it. Not we, humans, will do something like this, whether anybody likes it or not.
yeah. Well, no, and this opens such a large box of speculative possibilities, right? And another thing that I'd wondered about was, if these are some kind of a von Neumann probe, could this be something akin to, I think they've called it the space whale, or the being at Encounter at Farpoint, right, in Star Trek,
Right.
where it's
Well, I mean, here's one. I was actually watching Leslie Kean's documentary on Netflix, I think. No, Hulu. And that she was showing the relative movement of how long it takes for a jet to go take a right turn versus what these things are doing.
yeah,
And I was thinking, okay, so here you are, you're a jet pilot, you're flying around, and this thing is basically going like this and making right angle turns. What can think that fast? I mean, these things are going at 10,000 miles an hour. So you're deciding when to take, so getting from point A to point B is less than a second. And then you make another decision to go this direction and another decision to go that direction, all in the space of less than a second. So you have two possibilities. One, whatever it is that's driving it is thinking very fast. So it could be just a computer. Or two, what's going on inside the craft and time flow within the craft is going slower than otherwise. So I think there's a lot of things about the movements and observables that we can use to start to derive potential boundary conditions on what it is that's driving this. What's behind the scenes.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as time progresses, we'll start to look a lot more at things like machine intelligence and, hybrid biological artificial systems, and maybe less at, little gray men, using smooth control surfaces, right?
Mhm.
So again, I think a lot of this comes out of these preconceived notions of the mid 20th century. And a lot of that came out of basically just Cold War rhetoric, right? I
Mhm.
mean, a lot of people forget that, like, the zombies in those in the 1950s movies actually represented communism, and
Mhm.
my understanding is in many cases space aliens did as well,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
yeah. Well, Gary, let me thank you so much for your time today. It has truly been an honor to have you with me, and I appreciate all of your insights.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to the audience for listening.
Absolutely. Now, before we go, actually, I should ask, Where can we expect to see you next in the headlines? What's coming up next for Dr. Gary Nolan?
Nothing I can talk about.
Okay.
Nothing I dare talk about
Sir,
until it's ready.
on that note, let me thank you again so much for your
Mhm.
time today.
Okay. Thanks, Tim.